In this Blender tutorial, I will show you how to create this procedural meatball material in Blender. And on top of the meatball, we're also going to be creating a tomato sauce or a pasta sauce. And I'll show you how you can control how much of the sauce you want on the meatball. If you'd like to purchase this procedural material and help support the channel, then you can do that on my Gumroad store in my Patreon page with the links in the description. And you can also check out my Blender procedural material packs if you'd like to purchase more of my materials. And I also have a procedural food pack where you can just purchase my procedural food materials. And if you'd like to learn how to create any of my procedural materials, then you can also check out my Blender procedural material tutorial playlist here on YouTube. And then one more thing before we start, I wanted to let you know about the Physical Starlight and Atmosphere Blender add-on. Physical Starlight and Atmosphere is an amazing Blender add-on for creating realistic skies and sky lighting. I've used the add-on myself and I highly recommend it. You can customize the sun, atmosphere, stars, clouds, fog, and more. The add-on also provides some outstanding sky presets, such as daytime and sunset, fog and haze, Mars, and even retrowave. You can also change the time of day just by rotating the sunlight. Check out the add-on with the link in the description, and by purchasing the add-on through my link, you'll be helping to support this channel. Alright, so before we start, I wanted to show you what I have set up in the 3D scene if you want to set it up the same way that I have. So I pressed Shift A, I went here to Mesh, and I added an icosphere. And then right behind me, if you click on the little Add Icosphere arrow right there and open that up, I turned the subdivisions up to 6 so that it was very detailed. And then I just shaded the object smooth. And I want a very high poly detailed sphere because I'm going to be using the displacements in the node editor to actually pop out the mesh. And so if we have more geometry, it'll be more detailed. And then I also added a camera here and I just pointed the camera at the icosphere. Now for the lighting, I pressed Shift A and I added a plane. And then what I did is added the subdivision surface modifier to the plane, and that way it is a circular shape. And then I moved the plane right over here so that it is pointed towards the front of the sphere. And then so that this plane gives off light, I gave it a new material and I gave it an emission material, and I turned the strength up to 50, and I also gave it a slightly yellow color. But you could also go here to light and just add like a normal area light if you wanted to. And then also to get some really nice realistic lighting and reflections, if you go over here to the world properties, I added in this Machine Shop 02 1K HDRI. So this is a free HDRI from polyhaven.com, links in the description if you'd like to download it. So if you add a new world, right here next to color, you can click on the yellow dot there and you can choose environment texture, and then you can click on the open button and open up the downloaded HDRI. And again, on polyhaven.com, I downloaded the 1K HDR version. And then I also turned the strength to 0.8 to make it a little bit less strong. And then let's also go right up here to the render properties. I'm going to be using the Cycles rendering engine because Cycles is more realistic, and also I'm going to be using the displacements in the node editor. So if you want to use the displacements, you will need to be in Cycles. And then also if you open up the film tab right down here, I set the background here to transparent. So under film, you can check mark the transparent if you want to make the background transparent so you can't see the background HDRI. And then also to make the colors look a bit nicer and more saturated, if you go right here to the color management and open this up, you can set the view transform to filmic and the look here to high contrast. And this will pop out the colors and make things a bit more saturated and contrasty. And then one other thing I did to the sphere, if you go right over here to the modifier properties, I clicked on add modifier and I added the subdivision surface modifier, and I just set the viewport and render levels both to 1, and this is just going to subdivide the sphere and give it even more detail, and that way when we add the displacements, it'll have more geometry to work with. And then I'm also going to be using the Node Wrangler add-on to preview the different nodes. So if you don't have the Node Wrangler enabled, you can click on Edit and you can go to the Preferences and then click on the Add-ons tab, and you can search for Node Wrangler and just checkmark the Node Wrangler add-on. And the add-on is built into Blender, and I'll show you how to use it in the video. So then I am in the shading workspace, so I have the 3D space here, and I'm going to hold down the Z button and go up into the rendered view, and then I also have the shader editor right over here. So I'm going to click on the new button to add a new material. And then there is one more really important thing. If you want to use the displacements, you need to go right over here to the material properties, and I'm going to close these tabs and I'm going to open up the settings tab. So right here on the displacement, we want to change this to displacement and bump. So this is telling this material that it can use the displacements. So I'm just going to make this smaller to get this side panel out of the way, and then I'm going to rename this material to meatball. So we're first going to start by creating the basic meatball material. So I'm going to press Shift A, let's go here to the search, and I'm going to search for the noise texture, and let's stick the noise texture right here. And then I can Control Shift and select the noise texture, and that is going to use the feature of the node wrangler, and it will allow us to preview the different nodes on the object by Control Shift and selecting the different nodes. And then with the noise texture selected, I'm also going to press Control T, and that is going to add the texture coordinate and mapping nodes. And I want to use the object coordinates because the object coordinates will place the texture on the object more evenly. So let's take the object and I'm going to put that into the vector of the mapping. And I'm actually going to leave the mapping node because I'm going to use the mapping node to scale all the textures at once if I want to scale how big the textures are. So let's now change some of the noise texture settings. So I'm going to leave the scale at 5. I think that is pretty good. And I'm also going to turn the detail up a bit. So I'm going to turn the detail to 6. I don't want to turn it up too much because I don't want it to be too detailed, but I'll just turn it up to 6. And then also on the roughness here, I do want to turn the roughness up a little bit. So I'm going to turn the roughness to just a 0.7. So I'm now going to put the factor here from the noise texture into the principled shader base color so that we can actually use that as the color of the material. So let's take the factor and I can put that into the base color, and then I can Control Shift and select the principled shader to preview it. Now that isn't looking like a meatball, and we need to change the colors because right now the colors are just black and white. So I can press Shift A, let's go here to the search, and I'm going to search for the color ramp. And let's stick the color ramp in between the noise texture and the principled. So I can now change the colors of the color ramp to change the actual base color colors. So I'm first going to click on this white tab here, and I want to make this a dark brown color for the meatball meat. So I'm going to bring the color down so it's darker, and then make it kind of like an orangey color, and that is going to make it like a dark brown. I do want it to be pretty dark though. And if you want to use the exact same color that I'm using, you can go over to the hex value and you can punch in 241305. That is the exact color that I'll be using. And then I'm going to click on this black tab here, and this black tab, I'm actually going to make this like a light brown or a lighter brown. So I'm going to make this a bit brighter and then make it kind of orange, so it'll be kind of a brown color. And the hex value that I'll be using for this lighter brown color is going to be 7E5730. So you can go to the hex and punch in that value if you want to use the same exact color that I'm using. And then I actually want to make these a bit more contrasty, so I can drag these together, and you can see if I drag them really close, it's going to be very contrasty. I'm just going to drag this to about there, and then also maybe I'll bring this tab back a little bit, just like that, so it's a bit more contrasty. Now I also want to play around with this roughness, and I want to make it more shiny because I want to make the meat look very wet and oily and look like it was just cooked. But instead of using a single roughness value, I want some parts to be a little bit more rough and other parts to be a little bit less rough. So I'm going to take the noise texture factor and I'm going to stick that into the roughness of the principled shader. And then I want to have more control over this. So let's click on this color ramp here, and I can press Shift D to duplicate it, and we're going to drop it in between the noise texture and the principled. And then I want to reset this color ramp. So with this color ramp selected, you can hit the backspace and that'll reset the color ramp. So I can now change the colors of the color ramp to actually change how shiny the meatball is. So I'm going to click on the white tab here and click on the color. And if I make this darker, you can see the meatball is going to be much more shiny. Whereas if I make it lighter, it's going to be more rough. So I'm just going to make it kind of like a light gray. And to use the same exact color that I'm using for the light gray, over here on the hex value, you can punch in B6, B6, B6. So now the meatball is pretty shiny, but there are some parts along the texture where it's a little bit more rough. So it just makes it look a bit more random and natural. Now the meatball is still very smooth, and I want the meatball to be very lumpy, and I also want to add some values into the displacement to make it actually bumping out. So first I'm going to put this noise texture into the normal to give it some bump. So let's take the factor from the noise texture and I'm going to put that into the normal. Now we need to convert this to normal data because you can see there's some weird shading issues. So I can press Shift A Let's go here to the search, and I can search for the bump node, and we're going to stick the bump node in between the noise texture and the principled. And then to actually convert the black and white data into normal data, we want to put the noise texture factor into the height value. And now the meatball actually looks bumpy. Now that is very strong, so let's turn the bump strength way down. I'm just going to turn it down to like a 0.2 so that it is not very strong. But if you zoom in there, you can see there is still a lot of bump along the surface of the meatball. Now this still isn't looking quite like a meatball because it is very smooth along the edges. So I want to add another noise texture, and we're going to use that noise texture in the displacement. So I'm going to select this noise texture here, and I can press Control-Shift-D. So Control-Shift-D will duplicate the node, but it'll keep the wires plugged up. I'm just going to bring this noise texture down here, and then I can Control-Shift and select the noise texture to preview it. And let's change some of the noise texture settings. So I want it to be more lumpy. I don't want it to be super detailed. So I'm just going to turn the scale to like a 2.8, and that way it's going to be a bit smaller. And then I do want it to be very detailed, so let's turn the detail all the way up to the max of 15. But then I don't want there to be very much roughness, so let's turn the roughness back to the default, which is 0.5. So now you can see that there are just some big blobs of color. Some parts are lighter and some parts are darker. So I now want to put this into the displacement to actually make it bump. So let's take the factor from this noise texture, and I'm going to put this into the displacement of the material output. And then I can Control-Shift and select the principled shader. So you can see it's doing something, but it's really weird. It's like jutting off to the side. And why this is happening is because we need to convert this factor data into displacement data. So I'm going to press Shift-A. Let's go here to the search, and I can search for the displacement node. And we want to stick this node in between the noise texture and the displacement. And then I can drag it right here underneath the principled shader. And then to actually convert it to proper displacement data, I want the factor to be going into the height value instead. So now you can see it looks very bumpy. Now that is a bit too strong, so let's make it less strong. So right here on the scale, I can turn this down, and you can see it's much less strong now. I'm going to turn the scale to just like a 0.25. I think a 0.25 is pretty good for the meatball. So now this material is really starting to look much more like a meatball. Now there is one more really important thing that I want to do. I want to give it some subsurface scattering to allow a little bit of light through, and that's going to make it look a bit more fleshy and make it look a bit more like food. So right here on the subsurface, I'm just going to turn this up to like a 0.02, just a 0.02, so there is just a tiny little bit of subsurface scattering. But you can see it makes it look much more organic and natural, and it looks much more like food now. And then right here on this subsurface color, I'm going to make this kind of like a orange color and kind of dark so that it is kind of brown. And for the subsurface color, if you want to use the same exact value, you can go to the hex and you can punch in 5B 3D00. So there we have it. There is the procedural meatball material. So what I'm going to do is click and drag just to box select all these nodes here. So I'm box selecting the principled shader, the two color ramps, and the bump, and then also this noise texture. And I'm going to press Ctrl J, and that is going to join them together into a frame. And you don't have to do this, but I just want to do this to keep my nodes nicely organized. So then you can click on the frame and you can press F2 to add a label, and I can just call this meatball. So there we go. There is the meatball material, and then these nodes over here, that is controlling the mapping, and then this noise texture and the displacement, that is controlling the displacement. So if all you wanted to create was the meatball, then you can finish the tutorial here. But now we're going to be creating the tomato sauce, and I think adding the tomato sauce or pasta sauce really makes the meatball look much more interesting. So I'm going to be creating the tomato sauce down here, and then we are going to add it into the material. So let's press Shift A. I'm going to go here to the search, and I'm going to search for the principled shader. Let's click on the principled shader and drop it here. And then I want to Control Shift and select the principled shader to preview it. Now I want to turn the subsurface up a lot because I want a lot of light to go through the pasta sauce. So I'm going to take the subsurface and I'm going to turn that up to like a 0.3. And then let's click on the base color here, and I'm going to make this kind of like a dark red color for the tomato sauce. And if you want to use the same exact base color that I'm using, over here on the hex value, you can punch in 78 1500. And then I also want to change the subsurface color, and I actually want to make the subsurface color the same color. So I can just click and drag, and I can drop the color from here right down here. So you can just click and drag and drop the material down there. So now that is starting to look like tomato sauce. Now let's actually turn the roughness down because I want it to be very shiny, because tomato sauce is very shiny. So let's just turn the roughness to like a 0.25, and now it is much more shiny. And then I also want to add just a little bit of data into the normal to give it a little bit of bump. Right now there is some bump, but that is just from the displacement. So I also want to add a little bit of bump to the pasta sauce. So what I'm going to do is select this noise texture right up here, and I'm going to press Control-Shift-D. So Control-Shift-D is going to duplicate the node, but it'll keep the wire plugged up. I'm going to bring it down here, and then I want to take the factor and let's put that into the normal of the pasta sauce. And then we need to convert this to normal data. So right up here, you can see we added the bump node to convert it to normal data. So let's do the same thing down here. So I can press Shift-A, go to the search, and I'm going to search for the bump node, and let's put the bump node in between the noise texture and the principled shader for the pasta sauce. And then the factor here can go into the height value, so it converts it to proper normal data. And then I want to turn the strength way down, so let's just turn the strength to like a 0.2, so it is very subtle. So it's just going to add a little bit of bump. So what I'm going to do is click and drag to box select these three nodes, and I can press Ctrl-J, and that's going to join them together into a frame, and I can drag the nodes together to kind of compress them, make them a bit smaller and more compact. And then if I click on the frame, I can press F2 to add a label, and I'm going to rename this to sauce. So now we have the meatball material and the sauce material, and I can hold down the Control and Shift key and click between them to preview them. So I now want to join them together. So I'm going to bring the material output down here, kind of in between the two materials. And I'm going to press Shift-A. Let's go here to the search, and I'm going to search for the mix shader. Let's click on the mix shader, and I can drop it right here before the surface of the material output. And then I want to take the principled shader here from the sauce, and let's put that into the bottom shader, and then the meatball here can be going into the top one. So the mix shader is going to mix these two materials together, and if I drag the factor, that's going to tell it to only use the sauce, or if I turn the factor down to 0, it's only going to use the meatball. But instead of dragging around this value, I want the top part to be the sauce and then the bottom part to be the meatball. So to do this, we need to create a mask, and we need to put the mask into the factor. So I'm going to drag the sauce down so that we have a bit more space, and I can drag the displacement over. I'm actually going to put the displacement node right here underneath the mix shader. And then just to kind of get this out of the way, I'm going to click and drag to box select these nodes. I can bring them back a bit, and then I'm going to bring this noise texture up here. So I want some space right in here in between the meatball and the sauce that I can create the gradient. So I'm going to press Shift-A, let's go here to the search, and I'm going to search for the gradient texture, and let's put the gradient texture right here. And then I can Control-Shift and select the gradient texture to preview it. And we're going to use the gradient texture to tell it where it's going to be the meatball and where it's going to be the sauce. And then I actually want to use the generated coordinates of the texture coordinate. So on the generated here from the texture coordinate, let's take the generated, and I can put that into the vector of the gradient texture. Now I want to rotate the gradient texture because I don't want the gradient to be right here. I want the gradient to instead be going up and down. So I'm going to click on this mapping node, and I can press Shift-D to duplicate it, and I can put the mapping node right here before the gradient texture. And then I'm going to drag it over and kind of stick it underneath this mapping, and we could also bring the texture coordinate down kind of in the center of the two mapping nodes. So now on this mapping node, which is going into the gradient, I can rotate the rotation Y, and that's going to rotate the gradient around. So I'm going to change the rotation Y to 90 degrees, and that way now the gradient is going to start down here as black, and then as it goes up, it'll get lighter and lighter. Now I don't want the gradient texture to be super smooth. I want the gradient texture to be much more sharp, and I also want it to be lumpy to kind of make the pasta sauce look like it's dribbling down the meatball. So to do this, I'm going to take this noise texture here, I'm going to bring it up, and then I can press Control-Shift-D. So Control-Shift-D will duplicate the node but keep the wires plugged up. And I could also box select these nodes, maybe bring them down a little bit. and then I can Control Shift and select this noise texture that we duplicated. So I'm going to put this noise texture into the gradient. I'm going to mix it with the vector, and that way the noise texture will distort how the gradient shape is. So to do this, I can press Shift A, let's go to the search, and I can search for the mix RGB. Let's put the mix RGB right here before the gradient. And then right here over here on the mapping, I want the mapping vector to actually be going into color 2 of the mix RGB. And then I want this noise texture here, the one that we duplicated, I want the factor to be going into color 1. And then I can Control Shift and select the gradient texture to preview it. So now if I drag the factor here on the mix, if I turn it all the way up to 1, it's just going to use the mapping, but then if I turn the factor all the way to 0, it's just going to use the noise texture. Now instead of setting it to mix here, I want to click on this, and I instead want to change it to the linear light. And this way I could drag the factor, and you can see if I turn the factor up, it's going to now use this noise texture to make the gradient all lumpy. So the gradient still is there because the gradient is darker down here and then lighter up here, but now this noise texture is making the edge of that gradient very bumpy and noisy. So I will turn the factor all the way up to 1 so it's completely using the noise texture to distort the gradient. Now I do want to change some of the noise texture settings because I actually don't want it to be this detailed, because this is going to be the gradient for the pasta sauce. I want it to be a little bit more lumpy and blobby. So I'm going to take the scale here of this noise texture and I'm going to turn it to like a 4.8 so that is a bit bigger, but then I don't want it to be very detailed because right now it is very detailed. So let's turn the detail to just like a 2, and this way it'll be more lumpy. And then I actually don't want this much roughness, so let's turn the roughness down to like a 0.3. So if we turn it down to 0.3, now you can see we just have these little blobs which are kind of coming down, and this is going to make it look like the pasta sauce is kind of dribbling down the meatball. Now I want to control where the gradient is, because right now the gradient is actually covering most of the meatball, but I actually want the gradient to be kind of up here, so it's just kind of covering the top of the meatball. So to do this, I can press Shift A, let's go to the search, and I can search for the color ramp, and let's put the color ramp here after the gradient texture. And so I can now drag the black tab of the color ramp, and that is going to control where the gradient is. So wherever the values are white, that is where the tomato sauce is going to be, and then wherever it's black, that is where the meatball is going to be. So I'm going to drag this kind of to about here so that there's much more meatball, and then I'm also going to click on this white tab and I'm going to drag it over a little bit so it's a bit more contrasty. So we can now take the color of this color ramp and we're going to stick that into the factor of the mix shader to control where it's going to be each shader. And then I can Control Shift and select the mix shader to preview it. And now you can see that the pasta sauce is just on the top of the meatball. And if for some reason this is the opposite, what you can do is you can just click on this shader here, pull out the wire and stick it into the bottom one, and that is going to flip it. But I don't want it to be flipped, so I'm going to click and drag and drop it right there. So the sauce is going to go into the bottom one, and then the meatball is going to go into the top one. So that is looking really cool, but I actually want the sauce on top to be a bit more smooth, and it's going to be a bit more lumpy. Because right now, it's just using the displacement of the meatball, but I actually want it to be much more smooth on the top. And then also, I want the pasta sauce to be a bit more thick. So I actually want to make the pasta sauce be popping out a bit. So we are going to take this color ramp value here and we are going to mix it in with the displacement to actually make the sauce be popping out a little bit more. So to do this, I can press Shift A, let's go to the search, and I can search for another mix RGB. And I want to put the mix RGB right here in this wire before the displacement height. So just stick it right there and just put it right next to the displacement. And then I want to take the color ramp color and I want to put that into the factor of the mix RGB. And then I can Control Shift and select the mix RGB to preview it. And then right up here, we had this noise texture, and this noise texture was controlling the bumpy part of the meatball, and I want the factor of that to be going into color 1. Now, I just want to add the light values, because if I Control Shift and select the color ramp, you can see these top values here are white, and that is where I want the pasta sauce to be popping out more. So I just want to add the light values. So if I click on the mix here, I can change this to lighten, and then let's Control Shift and select the mix shader to preview it. So I can now take color 2 and I can turn this up, and you can see as I turn it up, it's going to add more and more of the sauce. So now the sauce is actually popping out and there's some really thick sauce now on the meatball. So I'm going to turn color 2 all the way up to 1. Now this is a bit too strong right now, and so I want to make the sauce a little bit less strong. And if the pasta sauce isn't very thick, you would be able to see through it a little bit. So I want to make it a bit less strong and also a bit less visible. So to do that, I can change the color ramp white value, because on this color ramp, the white value is controlling how much sauce there is. So if I click on the white tab, I can turn this down, and you can see if I turn it down far enough, there isn't going to be any sauce at all. But then as I turn it up, there's going to be more and more of that red color, and the pasta sauce is going to be a bit stronger. So you can just change this to your liking. And if you want to use the same exact value that I'm using, I'm going to be using a hex value of CD, CD, CD. So that is the gray color that I'll be using for the amount of pasta sauce that I want. So now you can see there is a little bit of pasta sauce, and the sauce is popping out more. So it looks like it's on top of the meatball, but then you can kind of see the meatball through the sauce. It is kind of just a thin layer. But then the sauce also looks like it's kind of dribbling down. You can change the amount of sauce just by dragging this value here. So if you want the sauce to be dribbling down farther, you could drag this down. And then also if you want to change the size of all the textures, you can go over here to this mapping, and I actually want one single value to change all the scale values. So I can actually just press Shift A. Let's go here to the search, and I can search for a value node, and let's put the value node underneath the texture coordinate. And then I want the value to be going into the scale of the mapping. And this way, this single value is going to change all of the scale, the XYZ scale of this mapping. And then I need to turn it back to the default value, which is 1. And so now I can drag this value, and that is going to change the size of all the textures, because all these textures are going through this mapping, and so this value will change the size of the textures. So if you have a bit larger meatball or a bit smaller meatball, you could change that value. And then of course right over here on the displacement, if you want to change how strong the displacement is, you can drag the scale of that displacement. So there we have it. There is the procedural meatball material with the sauce. So I'm now going to give this a final render. So thank you so much for watching this tutorial. I hope you found it helpful, and I hope you enjoyed it. And if you'd like to help support me and my YouTube channel and purchase the material, then you can get that over on my Gumroad store and my Patreon page with the links in the description. And some great ways to help support the channel here on YouTube is by checking out the YouTube memberships by clicking down there on the join button next to the subscribe button. And if you enjoyed this video and you'd like to send me a little tip, you can also use the super thanks feature here on YouTube to give me a little tip, and I do really appreciate your support. And if you'd like to purchase more of my procedural materials, you can also check out my Blender procedural material packs. And if you'd like to learn how to create any of my procedural materials, then you can check out my Blender procedural material tutorial playlist here on YouTube. All the links are in the description. But I hope you enjoyed this, and thank you for watching.